social unrest on the streets of the French capital. Protesters say the only way to break the cycle of chaos is for Emmanuel Macron to resign.
For Emmanuel Macron and his government, this is only the beginning of a long fight over who pays the price of reform.
France has lost its third prime minister in under a year.
The French government just collapsed because it's going broke. National debt is going through the roof and credit agencies are downgrading the country. That's because France didn't just hit the debt ceiling, they launched a baguette through it. The crisis seriously threatens President Macron and it could trigger a snap election. Meanwhile, the tensions between France and the European Union are growing every single day. It's accusing France of reckless spending, which could damage the euro currency and the common European market. So the question rises, why is this all happening and what will be the consequences of this crisis? Let's start by unpacking the core of France's problem, namely its rising national debt. It's worth comparing France with Germany, a country that uses the same currency, is in the same trade bloc, and roughly has the same level of economic development. As you can see from the chart on your screen, France and Germany were roughly on par back in 2008, with debt being at under 70% of the GDP. Then Germany chose spreadsheets and France chose croissant and vibes. That's to say, the two countries followed a radically different course ever since. Germany's debt to GDP is still under 70% to this day, while France's debt is now nearing 120% of GDP. There's nothing mysterious that's going on here. Every year, the French government spends way more than it earns, which leads to chronic deficits and rising debt. In fact, the last time France had a balanced budget was more than 50 years ago. They should stop calling it a deficit and start calling it a lifestyle choice. But you see, one thing is clear. The bill always comes due. For France, it's 3.35 trillion euro bill to be precise, nearly $4 trillion. And to understand how bad this is truly, we have to look at the bond market. That's basically where people buy and sell government debt, issued by countries like France. The interest rate on the bond market tells us how much trust there is in the government. When investors buy bonds in a financially stable country, they're fine with a lower interest rate. But when they buy a bond in a risky country, they want a higher interest rate as a compensation. This is something that's called risk premium. And it's clear that France's risk premium is going up every single day. The interest on 10-year government bond in France is at 3.5% right now. In Germany, it's only at 2.7%. In the case of government bonds, the 80 basis point difference is huge. It might not seem like much, but when you're talking about trillions of dollars in debt, it starts to add up and compound very quickly. Now, just to put things in perspective, France's 10-year bond are more expensive than Greece's, which stand at 3.4%. Greece is notorious for being the most dangerous country in the Eurozone to lend money to because it just had a huge debt crisis a couple of years ago. But now, investors seem to trust Greece more than they trust France. The price tag is starting to show. This year, France is going to pay 66 billion euros in interest alone, or about 78 billion US dollars. It's more than 2% of the GDP, larger than France's budget for education or its budget for military, which honestly just makes them America, just with better bread. If nothing changes though, in just next 4 years, these interest payments will grow to become the biggest expense for the French government, bar none. To outsiders, it seems very clear what France is supposed to do. It needs to balance the freaking budget, spend less and tax more. I'm sure Dave Ramsey would be proud, but instead they're only digging the hole deeper. In 2024, the French government had the deficit of 5.8% of the GDP, and this year it's probably going to be 5.4%. Continue with that just for a few more years, and the national debt climbs to a level where France just cannot get it back down anymore. This really is the nightmare scenario. Interest payments could force the French government to keep taking on more and more debt. At some point, the bond market will lose trust and the interest rate will go up even more. This leads to a vicious cycle with more debt and higher rates, which could bankrupt the country. But luckily, of course, this can absolutely be prevented. And France is not at a point of no return yet. But financial analysts are definitely taking the scenario seriously. Credit rating agencies are downgrading France, with Fitch Rating downgrading the country from AA- to A+, which sounds like a positive, but in the bond market, it's really not. This move puts France several levels below its peers. It also shows the financial world that France is a riskier country to lend money to. Massive pension funds and insurers could start to avoid the French bonds because they prefer to invest in higher rated countries because of the safety. And that means if demand dries up for the French bonds, it only worsens the interest rate situation. Now, I'm sure many of you guys are asking the obvious question. Why is this all happening in France? After all, it is a wealthy country with higher GDP per capita than the EU average. It doesn't seem reasonable to flood the country with debt, but they are doing it. Now, the French government can blame the 2008 financial crisis, the COVID crisis, or the recent energy crisis. And to be fair, those are all good points. A lot of debt creation did happen during these years, with 7.4% deficit in 2009 and an 8.9% deficit in 2020. Now, according to Keynesian economics, governments should take on debt during crises, especially to provide a buffer. But in France, the debt from these crises never actually went away. Instead, debt to GDP only went up over time. The reason for this has to do with France's unique welfare state. The government gives income to the poor, provides a social security net for all citizens, and gives people pensions and sponsors healthcare and education. It's kinda like Social Security and Medicare here in the United States, but way more generous. Now, of course, I don't want to sound like someone who's saying that these are all bad things, but at the end of the day, someone has to pay for it because money has to come somewhere. Now, of course, the French people love this because it's part of their unique French social contract between the government and the people. But the price tag is enormous. In France, the government expenses are about 57% of the GDP. You could say that the government controls more than half of the economy, which sounds less like capitalism and more like mild socialism with a wine budget. Compare that to the United States, where the government expenses are 36% of the GDP, and that's combining federal, state, and local spending. The French government needs to collect a lot of money to afford all this. Most of the burden falls on the workers. 47% of the labor cost goes to the government in form of personal income tax and social contributions for employees and employers. Basically, French people are working to pay the government on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday morning. And on top of that, if you have a really high-paying job, you need to pay way more than that, with taxes and contributions far exceeding half of your income. There's also a value-added tax of 20% on consumption, with several exceptions. Corporations also need to pay a 25% tax on all profits made in France, plus an additional 3.3% social contribution when they are large. Now, of course, this all sounds like a lot, but these taxes are still not enough to fund all the programs the government offers, and that's what's leading the country to go into debt. Most of this comes down to the French pension system, which is incredibly expansive. A quarter of all public spending goes to pensions alone, about 420 billion euros, or 14% of the GDP. It's more than what France spends on education, defense, public transport, research, justice, and infrastructure combined. On top of all this, the cost has been growing very fast. Of the last 1 trillion euros that France has borrowed in debt, 50% went to pensions. Now, on the balance sheet, the French government tries to hide this as best as it can. For example, a portion of spending on education is actually going to retired teachers, aka pensions. Same is true for defense spending, where 1/6 is going to retired soldiers, aka pensions. Now, that's a very useful accounting trick if you need to hit the NATO spending target of 5%, but it's not going to help against Russia. Unless, of course, the threat of 10,000 retired soldiers is a new military deterrence. One thing is clear though, the French pension system is fundamentally broken. It goes all the way back to the creation in the aftermath of World War II. France, like many other countries, decided to create a pay-as-you-go pension system organized by the state. This means that the people who are currently working pay for the people who are currently retired. Back in 1960, this was no issue. Every 100 working-age people only had to support just 18 retirees. But now, every 100 working-age people in France have to support 36 retirees. The reasons why this has gotten so out of hand are declining birth rates in France and the aging population. But the thing is, France's demographic problems are not even that bad compared to other developed countries like Germany or Italy. Still, the spending on pensions got way out of hand in France, even more so than in these other countries. That's because of a unique phenomenon in the French pension system. It's really generous. Through mandatory state pension, retirees can get up to 50% of the income they earned during their 25 highest earning years. It's also inflation adjusted. Right now, the maximum payout retirees can get is capped at 47,000 euros a year, or around $56,000. That's higher than the GDP per capita of the country. But on top of that, people get mandatory occupational pensions, which can push the income up to 70 to 80% of what they got during their career. But this doesn't come from the state, but from a separate individual account. Still, it's a nice extra. On top of that, many retirees also have a personal pension plan on the side. If you add this all up, French retirees now have a higher relative income than working age adults. That means, in France, retirement is not an exit, it's an upgrade. It's the only country in the world that has this, and it's creating a lot of problems. You see, working age adults are the ones who need the income to buy a house or to start a family. But now, 28% of the labor cost of working age people goes to the pensioners alone. All the while, working age adults in France are struggling from a cost of living crisis. Something else that doesn't really make sense is that French people retire very early. And I know it's a controversial topic. We shouldn't be deciding when people retire. But the problem is, the earlier people retire, the more government has to pay. And in France, people retire a lot earlier than other countries. You see, back in 1980s, French president cut the retirement age from 65 to 60. It has since increased to 62, then later to 64. The latter actually causing mass protests in Paris just a few years back. We covered that on this channel, but 64 is still pretty low compared to international standards. In Germany, the retirement age is already at 65 and they are raising it to 67. Here in the United States, they are going up to 67. The reason is pretty straightforward. People live longer, there's not enough money to fund longer retirements. And clearly, France also doesn't have money for this. With a life expectancy of 83, people would get 19 years of retirement, which gets way too expensive. But raising the retirement age or cutting any benefits for the retiree is politically impossible. In reality, everyone likes the idea of retiring early with a comfortable government pension plan. Most people vote to keep the pension system how it is, especially the boomer generation. But on the other hand, people don't want to pay for the pension system with even higher tax rates or social contributions. It's the fiscal version of, I want abs, but I also want to eat cake. It leaves the government with only one option, and that is government debt. Down the line, this causes problems that are just way too big. As French former Prime Minister Michel Rocard once wisely said, the pension problem is enough to topple several governments. He was exactly right, as this is precisely what's happening over the last few months. So let's talk about the political crisis. The problems with national debt and the pension system turned into a huge crisis for Macron. But to understand all this, we first have to look at how the French politics works, because it's quite different from other countries. France has a multi-party system with quite a few political parties on the left, on the right, and in the center. The most powerful legislative body is 577-member National Assembly, elected from 577 districts. You can think of it like US Congress. In order to pass laws, a government needs at least 287 seats in this assembly. Now, the government officials, including the prime minister heading the government, are appointed by the president, the head of the state. This president is chosen in a separate nationwide election. Officially, the president doesn't really get involved in policy making directly, but in practice, he's right at the center of French politics, overshadowing the prime ministers. Since 2017, a French president has been Emmanuel Macron. He is part of the Renaissance Party, which is a leading party within the centrist Ensemble coalition. He was extremely powerful at first, but in 2022, his position significantly weakened. He won his second presidential race, but during the legislative election, his alliance lost over 100 seats. This meant that Macron couldn't get legislation passed on his own and had to make compromises with other parties. Then in 2024, the nightmare scenario happened for President Macron. During the European Parliament elections that year, where France could choose its representatives to the EU, the right-wing National Rally scored a massive victory, getting more than double the votes of Macron's alliance. Meanwhile, Macron's approval ratings had declined tremendously. Polls varied, but in 2024, about 60 to 70% French people disapproved of the president. Then Macron made a very unexpected move. Hours after hearing the European election results, he dissolved the National Assembly, triggering a snap election. Maybe he thought that he could benefit from the anti-national rally sentiment. But in the end, the snap election only made things worse for his presidency. His alliance lost another 86 seats, down to a mere 159 out of 577. The left-wing New Popular Front alliance became the largest with 180 seats. The right-wing National Rally gained the most seats, going up to 142. These results created an impossible situation. Neither the left, the center, or the right wing had enough seats for a majority, but no one wanted to work together. Macron later recognized that the snap election brought more division to the National Assembly rather than solutions for the French people. Soon after the election results came out, Prime Minister Attal resigned. Macron appointed a new Prime Minister, Bernier, for a new government, but he only lasted for a few months. His hardest task was to pass the 2025 budget before the deadline at the end of the year. The national debt was getting out of hand and the government wanted to cut the deficit from 60 billion euros, about $70 billion. But the left wing and the right wing did not support the plan. This led to a no confidence vote in the National Assembly in December of 2024, the first of its kind since 1962. Bernier had to resign without a budget in sight. After the fall, President Macron appointed Prime Minister Brayu, hopefully I'm saying that right, for this impossible job. In order to get any budget passed at all, the new government used Article 49.3 in the French Constitution. This article allows the government to bypass the National Assembly and force a decision through, which got the budget passed in February. This budget had 30 billion euros in spending cuts and 20 billion euros in tax increases. It wasn't much because it could only cut the deficit from 5.8% down to 5.4% of the GDP. But as politics goes, the opposition wasn't happy. When Brayu tried to pass the 2026 budget with 44 billion euros in cuts, he was ousted in yet another no-confidence vote. Now, Brayu knew he was going to be ousted before the vote even began. He was the prime minister with the lowest approval rating since 1958. He had approval rating of airline food and political future of MySpace. It just goes to show how unpopular austerity measures are in France. But Brayu made one last speech that would go down in the history books. With some very sharp words, he blamed the boomer generation for not caring about the debt situation. He said, "We have broken the bond of trust between generations, the very foundation of the social contract. Young people feel like a sacrificed generation trapped in a form of servitude from which they must be freed. True awareness also means that the older generations should come together to ease the burden on the debt that the young people will one day have to repay." Since the fall, Macron has appointed a new prime minister, the seventh one in his presidency. Macron has said he won't give up the presidency until the end of his term in 2027. But the political reality is very bad for the French president because his centrist coalition has lost a ton of support. In opinion polls, the right-wing National Rally is ahead with 33% and left-wing New Popular Front is at 25%. Macron's coalition is only at 15% and the Republicans are at 11%. the National Rally has no incentive to cooperate anymore, and it wants a new snap election as soon as possible to consolidate its gains. The left is also eyeing potential gains. Even when Macron does not go for a snap election, this crisis could damage his reputation even more. People start to look for alternative, giving the left and the right even more support. But even when the left wing or the right wing gets in power in France, the deficit problem will not be solved. That's because no one really wants to solve the underlying problems, they just want the power. Last year before the election, the New Popular Front already presented their economic plans. They want to massively increase government spending with higher wages for government employees, government subsidies for housing, and more spending on healthcare and education. They also want to lower the retirement age to the pre-2010 level of 60 years. To fund this program, which is going to cost quite a lot, they want to tax the rich through wealth taxes, and they want to take money from big corporations. By 2026, they plan to take in 150 billion euros this way. In words of one French socialist, they want to take money from the pockets of those who have the means to give it. And they want to spend most of it because reducing the deficit is not their number one priority. This economic program has sparked outrage with critics, calling it a total delusion. The former chief economist for the IMF said that it will cause entrepreneurs to pack their bags and leave the country. But the reason why so many people back such a radical socialist economic plan is very understandable. There's a growing wealth inequality in France. With the elderly accumulating a ton of capital, jobs just don't pay like they did 60 years ago. This then leads to another phenomenon, namely inherited wealth. In France, 60% of all wealth is already inherited, and this is rapidly increasing. By 2040, 9 trillion euros, or more than $10 trillion, will be passed down as an inheritance to children, with inheritance reaching 20% of the GDP. That's great when your parents are wealthy, but when your inheritance isn't that big, you've got a big problem. Especially if you're being taxed into oblivion. Not everyone supports wealth taxes though. The other contender for the power, the National Rally, is also getting a ton of support. One National Rally lawmaker promised that we won't let the deficit run out of control. We won't use any wiggle room which France no longer has, and will break with the 50 years of systematically running deficits. However, when you look at the solution they're offering, it's not clear how they'll make this happen. Some of their proposals are to cut tax loopholes and to remove the government red tape. They also want to cut welfare for immigrants and restrict access to expensive refugee asylums, which strongly resonates with the public. Another area they want to cut is spending on policies to combat climate change. They also want to get discounts from the European Union on their contributions. But these things are not where most of the government money actually goes. That would be pensions for the elderly. In this area, the National Rally won't ever compromise. For a while, they also argued to reduce the retirement age from 64 back to 60, although they're now saying it's only for the people who worked 40 years already. So one thing is clear, none of the big parties want to cut pension spending, and the ones that do get crushed in the polls. But there's a whole layer to the story that we have not touched on yet, and that's France's relationship with the European Union, which is rapidly going downhill. You see, all of the debt created in France is denominated in euros, a currency that's used by 20 different countries. France is also part of European single market with 26 other countries. Because they all depend on each other, the European Union has made several rules to protect the currency and the market. In one of the treaty called Maastricht, they decided that the maximum deficit could be 3% of the GDP and the maximum national debt could be 60% of the GDP. Now, there have been some changes to these rules because during an economic crisis, countries are allowed to have more than 3% deficit. And when countries exceed the 60% debt to GDP rule, they only have to reduce the national debt gradually. But while several countries complied with these rules, like Germany and the Netherlands, some countries have flat out ignored them. This once led to the Eurozone economic crisis, where several member states had debt spiraling out of control. They had to receive help from others to avoid collapse. This nearly broke the European Union project because countries with healthy finances did not like to bail out dysfunctional countries. To prevent this from happening again, the European Union improved its oversight and launched the excessive deficit procedure, with potential sanctions against countries who ignored the 3% rule. But today, countries are once again ignoring the rule, and France is the biggest example. The country is using huge deficit spending that go above and beyond the EU norms. That's why European Union recently launched this excessive deficit procedure against France, saying that France's debt creates a high risk over medium term. Theoretically, the European Union could now demand France to pay a fine to other countries. That has never happened before and will probably never happen because of the political consequences. There's a real risk that France follows the UK and leaves the Union in so-called Frexit, because countries don't really like being policed by others. But the EU cannot sit still. France is the EU's second biggest economy, and if it doesn't listen to the rules, nobody will. Italy has a debt to GDP of 135%, and EU is demanding them to cut this back. But if France doesn't do it, Italy will not do it either. Same goes for Poland, which has also triggered an EU excessive deficit procedure with a deficit of 6.6% of the GDP last year. They don't want to slow down either. Their argument is that their deficit spending is a great tool to fuel economic growth and investment, and that they can afford it without long-term debt problems. Still, excessive spending could lead to major issues down the line, especially when France gets into a financial crisis. The EU could never allow France to go bankrupt because it would lead to a meltdown of the European market and the euro currency. But in Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark, and other countries, public opinion could turn against France and the European Union in general. After all, why have a shared currency and a shared market when others keep causing problems? So, this issue of the French debt crisis is very important, both for the future of France and the future of Europe. A collapse is not imminent yet, but if problems are not addressed, it could get very, very ugly. As an outsider, this whole thing might seem a bit strange. After all, can't people see that their government is going broke? And can't people accept that the government will have to make cuts, especially on pensions? Now, these seem like reasonable questions, but the thing is, same problem is happening all over the world. Here in the United States, the deficit was 6.4% of the GDP last year, which is higher than France. And America's debt to GDP ratio is also higher than France at 119%. The reason is simple, it's due to the massive spending bill that both parties keep passing on. There is a similar problem going on in Southern Europe, where they're struggling with the same thing. There are also deficit and debt problems in Asian countries like Japan, so it's truly universal, and sometimes it makes you question, who do we owe all this debt to? So let's end with the famous quote from Thomas Sowell that explains this pretty well. The first lesson of economics is scarcity. There is never enough of anything to satisfy all those who want it. But the first lesson of politics is to disregard economics. And the second lesson is to blame the last guy.